So hopefully you all had a phenomenal long weekend. We got to relax and do absolutely nothing. Super duper. So the good news is we're going into another chapter. Now keep in mind your assignments, by the way. We are up to assignment number 3 and assignment number 4 I'm going to be giving you today. So make sure that these are being submitted because that is one big chunk of your final mark. So you want to make sure that you're not missing out on that percentage. Let me just double check where it was again.
Sir, are we having a quiz today?
We're going to have the quiz at the end because you're covering similar territory you did on Friday. And that's what the quiz is on, so might as well wait till the end of it. Just keep in mind that we're up to assignment number 4, and I'll be giving you that a little bit later. Actually, I can give it to you right now. Put it in the chat before my voice goes totally. Oops. I'll put it in later. There you go. Okay, done. Just pull this out of the way. Fantastic. Can you see my screen? Dismissals and resignation.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Okay. So this is an area that we need to talk about a little bit because it is such a dynamic area for human resources. In fact, on your final exam, there'll be a lot of questions in this particular area. So let's start into it. We'll take a look at this. We've covered quite a bit of it already, but we're going to take another look at it. So one of the things we often have to remember is that employers are required to provide either written information or money in lieu of. So in case they don't provide you with written notice, they do have to provide you with some kind of remuneration. So it's that multi-week notice. So let's just take it a step and take a look at how many weeks are required. So when we're actually looking at this, we talked about this on Friday as well. Less than 3 months, nothing is required whatsoever. You can just terminate the employee and let them out the door. But after 3 months, they're entitled to at least 1 week's notice. And that means for every year thereafter, they're entitled to 1 additional week. So all the way up to 8 years where they can actually receive 8 weeks notice or 8 weeks payment for that period of time. So they get one or the other. For some companies, they may provide both. So this is also something to be considered. Severance pay, we kind of talked a little bit about this. It is that lump sum of money that is provided to you at the end of your tenure, whatever it happens to be with that particular company. And there are some very specific things that need to be met. You've been working or employed by that company for at least 5 years. And in addition to that, the employer must have a payroll of 2.5 million. As I pointed out on Friday, 2.5 million is not a very significant amount of money. That's only a few employees. When you think about it, you're looking at maybe 6 or 7 employees, and you're already in that category based on how much they're actually earning. Laid off 50 plus employees in the last 6 months. If that has happened, you're also required to pay out severance. And in addition to this, 1 week's pay for each year for a maximum of 26 weeks. That's quite a bit of money. I remember very few companies actually do pay out that kind of money. They don't usually let go of those employees unless there is no other way around it. Again, for review, what's better for an employer, working notice or pay in lieu of? And it's a really good question. Sometimes we want people to work until the last possible second. And it has a lot to do with what the company is trying to achieve during that period of time, especially if it's cash strapped and it needs to have you work out the term. You may have or may not have ever worked for a company that made you do that, but there are companies that do that. People working through the notice should be given generous opportunities to search for a new opportunity somewhere. This is something of a common courtesy. You recognize that the individual does need to have some kind of ongoing income, and therefore they should be looking for another opportunity. And if they do have to work to the last possible minute, you want to make sure that they have adequate opportunities to seek out alternative opportunities. So people working through the notice have access to sensitive business materials. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of companies prefer to release you and just simply pay you for the week or the 2 weeks or the 10 weeks, etc., that they may be necessary just simply to make sure that you don't carry any information with you. On Friday, I also gave you the indication that the higher you are in a company, the more likely they are going to walk you out of the business, especially particular types of salespeople who may actually have an opportunity to contact their customers or take a list of customers or contacts, or senior executives or managers who may actually take as much as they can to kind of, get paid for it, I guess you could say. So a lot of them tend to take stuff. And what companies often do is will walk you to the door so that you don't get that opportunity to come back again. Often they'll advise all of the employees that you've worked with that no contact should be made with these individuals until something happens. And it could be they just want to do some searches. They will seize and freeze all emails and all telephone calls and everything else. Structured separation packages, again, it depends on who you are within that particular company and how much the company needs your position to be continuous. So must meet the minimum statutory employment standards, again, may have to give a large sum at one time. This is quite possible. That individual may have worked for you for 10, 20 years, and you do have to pay them out. And it may be a significant portion that you have to pay them all at once. However, just remember that taxes are going to go after this, and unemployment insurance and CPP, and of course, EI will take their chunk out of it as well. The employer can continue salary and benefits during the notice period. This is something that some companies will do. It's just to encourage you to continue to apply yourself. So it must include statutory entitlements as well. And they do oftentimes pay you out this way. It depends on the security considerations of that particular organization and whether or not they're concerned about the losses of information, customers, or data per se. If you do have just cause, it's a little different. Just cause does not simply mean that the employer had a good reason. There's always a little bit more to this. Has the employee breached the contract of employment? Remember, it is fundamentally that contract that you are stipulating your acceptance of, and therefore you have to live up to the ramifications of the legal consequences of a contract. So fundamental way that the employer is no longer bound by common law obligations to provide reasonable notice of termination or pay in lieu of. And again, there has to be a significant reason for that contract to have been invalidated, voided, or just simply that the individual decided they just weren't going to do the job, in which case that contract would actually be invalidated. And of course, at that point, you can be sued as well. Remember, sometimes a contract is signed because there is an actual requirement for the company to have somebody in that position. And if you fail to live up to the expectations of that contract, then the ramifications are the company could be sued by its customers. And of course, the company could sue the employee as well, not just termination. So the onus of proof is always going to be on the employer. When it comes to dismissal with just cause, you have to actually demonstrate by showing a balance of probabilities that the employee actually intentionally breached that particular contract. In one way or another, they actually decided they were going to breach it. And because you can prove that it was breached, that may in fact be onus of proof. But once again, you need to prove it. It's an all or nothing proposition because companies get sued for dismissing and making sure that the employee actually has violated that contract. Either the employer proves that the employee breached the contract and wins the case, or what's going to happen is the employer fails to prove the employee breached the contract and it becomes wrongful dismissal, which means that that individual can not only get their job back, but they can even sue. And they will receive some kind of a judgment, either from the Board of Labor or from a court. So once again, the onus of proof is definitely on the employer's side, having to prove that there is a reason why dismissal must take place. Proportionality, common law expectation that any sanction or punishment must be proportional to the conduct to which it relates. So yes, you can dismiss somebody, but there has to be rationality for it. And it must be, let's say, on a level playing field with everyone else in that particular organization. So the punishment has to fit the crime in a sense. So it has to be proportional to the conduct, whatever that conduct happens to be. Once again, when we deal with a legal system, they're always looking to see what kind of policies does the company have, what does it have in place, how does it utilize those, and whether or not they are using it for everyone or just for a few people. So courts actually expect the application of the progressive discipline, positive or progressive, but mainly progressive in this situation. Most minor misconducts must usually occur more than once to constitute just cause. Let's just say that an individual decides, well, they're going to do it their way, whether you like it or not, and they still get the work done. Yes, you can discipline them, but you can't fire them. But let's just say that it happens over and over again, and it creates a situation where other employees begin to do the same thing. Well, that's a very, very significant form of misconduct, and therefore dismissal can take place. Again, you're trying to protect the environment. Can't dismiss someone just for showing up late once, but if this is constant, it's a different situation. But you're supposed to try desperately to find a way of kind of ratifying this situation so that it ceases to take place. The paradox here is when other employees see this going on for a long period of time and there's no corrective action, they tend to want to do the same thing. And the next thing you know, it becomes difficult to try to rein in anyone. Everyone is doing their own thing. So sometimes if it does continue and it's not stoppable, then dismissal, once again, is the only real outcome. Theft, assault, or significant sexual harassment are considered to go to the heart of the employment relationship and therefore may warrant an absolute dismissal. Again, it depends on the significance of the particular activity. Theft in this situation, well, what is it theft of? A pen, a pad of paper? What is it exactly that we're talking about here? Theft of goods from the company, or what is it? And you have to really take a good look at this. Assault, is this somebody getting into a fist fight with other employees? Well, that might be constructive dismissal or progressive discipline may be necessary in this case. But if it gets out of hand and it becomes a dangerous situation, then it becomes an absolute dismissal situation. The context, they always take a look at how the employee is interacting with the company. So the context is the courts will also take into account the employee side of it. They're going to look at how long has that employee been employed with that company? What is the function that they do within that particular company? What kind of performance issues have arisen in the past, or have any? Maybe what you end up with is something went wrong all of a sudden at home, and the next thing you know, you've got a really disgruntled individual, but they may have worked for 5 or 6 years with no issues whatsoever. Once again, progressive dismissal or progressive discipline becomes one of the better ways of dealing with a situation like that. And of course, what kind of record do they have for causing problems within the organization? Any mitigated circumstances in the past or present? And in addition to this, we have to look at that individual's characteristics. How important is that individual within that particular organization? Procedural fairness. Courts will expect that an employee be given opportunities to respond to the allegations. Remember, you have a vested interest in participating within the grievance or even the disciplinary process. You have a right to voice your particular concerns and your position, whatever that happens to be. And any kind of outcome whatsoever has to be in good faith. So everybody has to have literally, let's say, a homogeneous approach to every decision made in that particular organization. Not an easy thing to do, but you can't put bias in there. It's got to be separated from it. So it should be no ulterior motives involved in whatever decisions are made. Remember, the onus is on the employer to prove. Employer needs to consider the following characteristics. Was conduct planned or deliberate? In other words, and there's a variation here with planned or deliberate, because fundamentally they're very similar. And also the length of service of previous conduct. Maybe this individual has been with your organization for a long time, no issues whatsoever, so it requires a different approach. Any extenuating circumstances such as personal issues or provocation, again, we need to know what happened. What was the trigger that caused the individual to lose control or to do something that caused danger or harm to other individuals, or simply they started to steal, or whatever it happens to be? What was the cause of it all? We need to understand that. And once again, we're talking about doing a little bit of investigation so that you understand what the, let's say, the foundation reason was for the action. The employee's response to the allegations, such as an admission, denial, or refusal. or remorse or whatever actually comes across from the individual. You need to know, how does the individual see what has taken place? So if, for instance, misconduct has taken place, or let's say sabotage of the equipment, or theft of, let's say, product or whatever it happens to be, and now having been, let's say, introduced to the issue, how does the individual respond to that? Because this is also going to tell you whether or not that individual is coachable, whether or not that individual will be able to settle down and, let's say, act as they should be acting in the company. But again, you need to know what caused the situation. Condonation, once again, the employer must be careful not to condone the misconduct. Again, be careful, because number one, you are going to create a situation within the, let's say, the department or the company, where other individuals are going to start to respond in like kind. So they'll start to do the same thing, because if they can get away with it, so can they. And this is one of the problems that you oftentimes run into. Occurs when the employer discovers misconduct but doesn't decide to act on it. And that's an interesting scenario. It could be that the supervisor, they're close friends with one another, the supervisor and the employee, and therefore they don't want to ruffle any feathers. But in not doing so, they create serious situations where other people begin to do the same thing, or they begin to complain to other people in the company, which creates a lot of, let's say, negative environment, or a very acidic environment. Employer must be proactive on discipline. They must act immediately. You cannot hold off for long periods of time. People tend to forget what they did, and the next thing you know, when you talk to them, it's almost like you are deliberately pointing them out. But if you do it within a reasonable amount of time, they recognize that they've done something incorrect, and therefore it's easier to, let's say, discipline that individual. If you wait too long, it's very difficult, because now it's a game. It is, you are condemning me, I'm going to condemn you as well. So it becomes a fight between the two. So establishing grounds for just cause. Well, there are a couple of areas. Absenteeism is a big one. Remember, companies are paying you because they needed you to be present, doing some function or some job or some task had to be there being accomplished. And by your not being there, then it can't be done. If you're in customer service, being late all the time is not a good thing, because customers are oftentimes looking for you. And of course, they would be unable to actually find you. So that's not such a good thing either. And absenteeism, especially without reason, which is even worse still. Dishonesty is another significant role. Again, if you are dishonest, chances are other people are going to become aware of it. They are going to try to do the same thing. And this is one of the bad parts about dishonesty. Insolence and insubordination are another area. Remember, managers really only have one power, and that true power is to define work. And if you're not willing to do the work, then literally it's the only thing that they can actually cause you to do, because you signed a contract. And insolence and insubordination, it's literally like a disease. You can even say it's like a virus, because it will go through that company so fast. Other people will begin to do the same thing, and they'll show disrespect for their managers or their supervisors. So you can't allow this, period. In addition to this, disobedience is another big one. Doesn't happen very often, but sometimes people have a bad day and they decide they're going to fight back, even when there's no reason to. So disobedience could be one of those issues. And substance abuse. Well, nowadays it's difficult because of the, let's say, the acceptance of certain kinds of narcotics and the acceptance of certain alcohol and other products that are available. So substance abuse is a toughie because there is this accommodation rule and you do need to accommodate the individual. So once again, we go back to our method of disciplining that individual with either constructive dismissal, or we go back to positive, or we go back to something a little different. Intoxication is another area. And intoxication, remember, it is a disease, and therefore it has to be dealt with in a very specific way. But it could be, if it's continuous or if it's causing serious danger to the general public or customers or employees, it could be a very significant reason to remove the individual because of danger, health and safety. Sexual harassment, again, there's an awful lot of problems in this particular area. So this is another thing that could cause significant issues. Sometimes people don't understand, especially because of different cultures. You sometimes have cultures that are very, let's say, warm, friendly, touchy-feely types. And then, of course, you have other cultures which are very cold in the way they deal with other people. When you bring both of them together, of course, you run into serious issues from time to time. So sexual harassment is another area that needs to be dealt with. Off-duty conduct is a peculiarity. I do know of somebody who was fired instantly because of their behavior away from the company. I was an individual who was at a party, a company party, and actually went out, got really drunk, went outside and punched somebody. As a result, you just can't have people like that representing your company, and that person was immediately eliminated from the payroll, just simply told never to come back again. Incompatibility is another area, and again, I think you can figure out some of the examples of that one. And incompetence. Incompetence can be very dangerous if an individual really doesn't know what they're doing. I've seen some pretty horrific accidents take place because of incompetence. I remember my mother telling me one. She was a crossing guard in Mississauga. When she retired, she wanted something to do. So she became a crossing guard. And one day she got in her car to go home for lunch just after all the kids, and looked in her mirror, rear view mirror, and noticed that the machine that was tearing up the asphalt, the young kid with the stop sign had dropped his helmet, went to pick it up and got caught under the tracks. Of course, it crushed his head instantly. But you got to keep in mind too, that's incompetence because they're trained never ever to get that close to the machine. They must always contact the driver of the machine before they even go near it. Again, the driver is on the opposite side towards the sidewalk and they cannot see you. So let's take a look at each one of these. Again, you basically understand the idea of absenteeism and lateness. There's two types: culpable absenteeism, absent without any rational good explanation, period. You just decided, I'm not going to work today. Innocent absenteeism, can't get to work due to something that is beyond your control. Some circumstance that you just cannot get past. It could be there's a road blockage. It could be your car broke down. It could be that something happened and there's a fire in the house, or there's a flood in the house, or what have you. Or the kids are really ill and you have to take them to the hospital, or what have you. But you get the idea. Culpable, no excuse, just don't care. And innocent, again, you have an explanation, but you need to convey that. You can't just hold on to these things. So progressive dismissal is usually used for culpable absenteeism. Remember, we're not trying to slap you down and throw you out of the company. There's been a lot of emphasis on your job and getting you ready for that job. So we don't want to lose you if we can avoid it. And really, we really want to work through it and kind of solve the issue. If there's an issue there, we want to solve it and get rid of it. Single incident is just not a big deal. It may be that you've lost a few customers, and that could be a significant issue. But hopefully the next time it's not going to happen again. Courts will consider the context, and this is the key element. What is that context? What really caused it? They want to know, how long have you been working there? Is this something you do all the time? What kind of activity has taken place in the past? Have you gone through positive or progressive discipline in one form or another? Has something taken place before? Have they talked to you about this? Are there reasons that you're giving that are reasonable? And remember, with culpable, you're giving your reasons after the fact. This is not where you picked up the phone and actually called them and said, look, I can't make it in. This is you didn't bother showing up, period. Did the lateness or absenteeism harm the employer? This you must take into consideration because yes, a customer phones, can't get a hold of you. You're the only one who can deal with it. That customer can go somewhere else. It's their money. They don't need to deal with you. This happened in Quebec, and it's a very poignant lesson. In Quebec, they had that massive ice storm quite a few years ago. People started phoning up because they wanted to know about insurance and they wanted to call the bank and things like that. And all the telephone lines were down within that particular area. So people went to the competition and never came back. The losses were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Just think of it. You decided not to go to work and you didn't care, and they lost money. Well, they may actually want to take it out of you somehow, and maybe removing you is the best way. Is attendance policy considered enforced? In other words, is it unanimous with the entire company being, let's say, dealt with the same way? Or is it something where only certain people are, let's say, measured by their attendance? Innocent absenteeism. Well, in this case here, you can't impose any discipline because there's a reason, there's a valid reason, and the employee has reached out to the employer to tell them why they can't actually be there. Now, this may even happen afterwards, but at least you made the attempt to let them know, whereas culpable, you didn't. So if absent for disability, a duty to accommodate, once again, we try to help that individual. Whatever the rational reason was, we try to make it easier for that individual because once again, we put a lot into it. And again, it depends on what the reason and the rationality and whether or not undue hardship could be the end result. Minor illness does not qualify as a disability. So once again, a cold, people still go to work when they have a cold. I kind of wish they wouldn't. If you got the flu or you got a cold, stay away. Otherwise, you give it to everybody else. But at the same time, if your job needs you to be there, then you do have to make some kind of an effort. And permanent illness that prevents the employee from returning to the workplace can result in frustration. We've talked about frustration of a contract, how important that really is. Keep in mind that neither party can live up to the expectations, and therefore it's just not possible to continue. So the contract would be invalidated. Dishonesty is a rather significant issue because it can cause a lot of problems. It's fraud. It could be inaccurate overtime pay. These are things that companies often run into, especially factories, warehouses, where people actually do, when they go into work, they clock in with a card or a punch card, or they may have some other way of doing it. There are some companies in Scandinavia who have found a better approach, and that's putting a chip into you so that when you go into work, they know you're there, and when you leave, they know you've left. So accepting kickbacks, by the way, is illegal in Canada, period. Therefore, the company can remove you because they can be held accountable legally as well. Stealing company property is always going to be a big issue. Sometimes when you steal company property, you may be preventing other people from doing their job. And that really creates a serious issue. The courts do apply, once again, the context. So past behavior is looked into. They want to know, have you always been like this? If not, then figure out some kind of progressive discipline that you can both work with, and that will help in both situations. Hopefully the return of the product as well. Court looks for use of progressive discipline. Do you use it? Have you used it before with that individual? Or have you used it before with other individuals? So maybe there's a common issue within that particular company or department. If the theft involved, the value of the stolen article does not need to be significant. It really doesn't. It can be something very simplistic. For instance, it can be that you took a stapler home. A stapler prevents other people from using it, a 3-hole punch. It could be that you took paper home from the photocopier because you have a printer and you want to use it at home. Again, without permission, these things are not permitted. There's an old situation, which I remember hearing about, the legal side of it, which was an individual who asked about a computer. Computers were being thrown out, and asked the company, could he have one of those computers that they were throwing in the garbage for his son? And of course, they hadn't got back to him quite quickly enough, so he took one. As a result, he lost his job because that's theft. There is a reason why sometimes they cannot let you have something, and that is because they're writing it off, and therefore it must be disposed of. I've seen situations that are very similar to this, and yet at the same time, it can cause somebody to lose their jobs. Tips for employers to follow to protect themselves and the company itself on a legal basis provides clear and written policies. Employees must know what behavior is defined as, and they have to know what is unacceptable behavior. To steal or to take kickbacks or to take bribes is just not permitted. There are companies who simply don't trade anything with their customers simply because that can also be seen as theft. Picking things off the ground and keeping them for yourself, especially when you're on company property, is theft. You cannot take it. This is like walking into a Walmart, and this is something you're not going to like very much. But let's say you walked into a Walmart and you saw a $100 bill lying on the floor, and there's nobody around. Well, you probably would pick it up, put it in your pocket, and be very happy, except for one thing. Anything on the floor that doesn't belong to you specifically is the property of the organization. So even if the person in front of you dropped it out of their pocket, change or what have you, it still belongs to that company until the individual claims it that originally lost it. So you do have to investigate these things. You definitely have to know what's going on. Why is it taking place? And what exactly caused the issue? because maybe there are issues and you can see that you're going to run into problems in the future as well. Let's say an individual lost their car because they refused to pay for it. And it may have happened because they had to pay out more money for repairs to the house or whatever it happens to be. So they decide to steal something and try to sell it. This does happen. People do sometimes resort to such behavior. So when allegations cannot be proven, you provide a reasonable separation package. In other words, you definitely don't want to keep the person because you have a very strong suspicion that that is the individual who has caused the theft per se, or has taken something, whatever it happens to be. And you don't want to run into legal issues later on because maybe you just can't prove it totally. So what many companies are expected to do is to accommodate by providing a package of separation. In other words, they give you something to get rid of you per se. By the way, this particular situation that we just talked about, it happens in the banking community. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a bank, but in the banking community, when they find dishonesty, which does happen, then what they normally do is they will either give you one of two choices, and the unions are 100% behind this. They will send you to northern Canada to work beside the polar bears, or you can leave the company and they will pay you to get rid of you, simply because they don't want the publicity of an employee stealing in a bank. You could imagine how much of a challenge that would be for you. You would run to the bank and get all your money out of it as quickly as possible. Insolence and insubordination are big issues. You just cannot deal with that kind of an issue at work. It's difficult. It creates an acidic environment. It also turns people against one another within a collective. So lots of people working together become very, very difficult to work with. A single act of insubordination could provide just cause for termination or determination. It really is a question of to what degree is it? Is it something really significant, or is it something, just off the cuff, so to speak? And maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's problems at home, or maybe there's some other reason. So again, we look at the history of that individual. Disobeying a direct order for management is another issue. Again, this is not something that you're entitled to do simply because you agreed. You signed a contract, and as long as it's within that contract, you're expected to live up to your end of it. If the company loses money as a result of insubordination, they could be grounds to turn around, not only to terminate your employment, but also sue you. Remember, you're under contract. So generally, the employer must prove a pattern of insubordination or that there is insolent behavior with that individual. Don't run into this very often. It's a rarity, but it does happen from time to time. There are people with significant social or mental issues, and they tend to bring them to work with them every so often. Courts consider context again. They're looking at how long have they been with you? Have there been issues in the past? They're really trying to figure it out. What happened? What caused it? Disobedience, is it expected that the employer will, let's say, use progressive discipline to manage that particular situation? Or will they approach it in a slightly different way? Disobedience is an interesting conundrum. What does it apply to? Does it apply to a task that you're supposed to perform? Or does it apply to a scheduling issue? What does it apply to? And how is it represented within your contract? And once again, just because it happens once doesn't necessarily mean it ever will happen again. sometimes within 2 to 3 seconds thereafter, the individual starts second guessing themselves and wishing that they had kept their mouth shut. So this does happen from time to time. A single act is just not enough to simply remove that individual from the company, or let's say remove them from work for a significant period of time. I can give you a good example of the other one I just talked about, disobedience. There was an individual in the United States. This actually was an interesting tidbit. This individual won the lottery. So he went into his boss's office. He defecated and also urinated all over the boss's desk and chair, just as a message, and then he rubbed it into the desk. And then he went home. When he got home, he was really excited. He told his wife, you know, we just won the lottery. And she looked at the ticket and she said, did you look at the date? Because it was a week out of sequence. So unfortunately, he didn't win the lottery. His wife went back to his boss and asked whether or not they would please give him his job back. She explained the situation. And of course, her boss accommodated. He asked him to come back on his hands and knees and bark. If he showed how foolish a dog he was, he'd get his job back again, which he actually did give him his job back. Substance abuse is another big issue. The problem with substance abuse is it is referred to nowadays as a disability. When I was a teenager, it was considered to be instantaneous dismissal. I do remember guys years and years ago when I was a teenager who were found drunk. They would be fired immediately. There would be just no reconciliation whatsoever. It's just out the door. In fact, they would even push them out the door. They didn't want them inside the companies. So nowadays it's considered a disability, and therefore there's accommodation required. We try to help that employee over this particular period, whatever is causing the issue, providing rehabilitation service. Now, it's something you definitely have to be aware of. You can provide anything you want to an employee, but if they decide they're not going to participate, there is nothing you can do about it. You cannot force them to use a counselor or counseling service or any other kind of organization you set up for them. It's up to them entirely. And if they refuse it, then it may be necessary to remove that individual from the company. But again, it depends on constructive philosophies. Do we actually try to help that individual? We may actually use, let's say, some kind of system where we're looking for a step-by-step approach where we can send them away and then bring them back maybe a week later or something of that nature. If it's not successful for that particular employee, well, then you don't have a choice. And again, you have to release that individual. The individual may decide, yes, I'll take that service that you're providing me, and yet doesn't live up to it, which is quite possible. It could happen. If that's the case, then frustration takes place and that contract becomes null and void. Remember, with frustration, there is no need to provide anything. Intoxication is another issue. And once again, this is also considered to be a disability. It's referred to as a disease, a substance abuse problem. Once again, a single violation by an employee who is not a safety sensitive job. And that's the key element here, is it's not safety sensitive. If it is, then you have a serious problem, because it can cause significant issues. In Australia, there was an individual who was drunk, was driving a train. This is one of those bullet trains, and was drinking at the same time as he's driving the train. And of course, he didn't slow down at a curb and went slamming right into a mountain, which actually caused quite a few deaths. So this is something that is really important. You don't know. If this is somebody driving a transport truck, I wouldn't want to be on the road with that individual because you never know what they're going to do. And if it's somebody who's working on some heavy equipment or is working on a machine, they could seriously harm themselves as well. So this is one of those things where you have to look carefully at what is the overall circumstance and the environment that that individual is working within. Disciplining an intoxicated employee, the employee should consider, or the employer should consider, did the intoxication harm the business interest? If that individual is drinking in front of the business, it definitely has harmed that business. If this individual is hiding somewhere inside the building drinking, that's a little bit different, as long as they are not doing something that could cause harm to other people when they go back into their work environment. Was the employee treated in the past for intoxication? You know, sometimes you just can't stop them. A lot of people who have serious substance abuses, especially alcohol, people who are alcoholics have a really tough time getting away from it. And this goes for heroin, it goes for a lot of different elements, hallucinogenics and things of that nature that can cause the individual to want more of it. Well, if that's the case and they're working in an environment that can cause the company to be seen or reflected in the wrong light, then yes, they could actually remove that individual right away. Does the employee work in a safety sensitive area? People have killed themselves for no other reason than thinking they could fly, especially of a tall building where they're working, and then decide, well, they saw a butterfly, so they think they'll fly with it. You know, whatever gets you up in the morning. And what are the company policies on the matter? Well, once again, do you have a policy? Is it expressly prohibited within your contract, or do you have a policy that covers the contract? Remember, it's difficult to hold people accountable to something that they have rights to. Sexual harassment is another kind of bad area, subject to progressive discipline. You don't really want to lose people, but you want to curb their behavior. Somehow you're trying to eliminate it. Sexual harassment depends on the severity of it, but in most cases, it's nothing more than an individual being touchy-feely. In other words, putting their arm around you, trying to corral you or caress you or what have you. These are all things that need to be corrected. And again, it has a lot to do with what the individual perceives as being acceptable and non-acceptable behavior. They need to be trained how not to deal with certain things while they're working or even beyond that point. More serious cases could be grounds for immediate termination. The only caveat here is that there must be an investigation, because you can run into serious legal issues if you point fingers at anyone. You've often noticed that when somebody is stealing or something of that nature, most employees cannot tell the person, you're a thief, you stole something. They ask them to stick around until the police arrive. The police have the ability to investigate, the employee does not. So once again, with sexual harassment, it's the same thing. You must have an impartial investigation to figure out what happened and why it took place. Off-duty conduct, well, this is an interesting area, because you would think the moment you leave the company, you're basically on your own time. However, you might actually be causing trouble for the company. So generally, it's contact or conduct that takes place away from the business. but maybe you're still connected somehow. Maybe you're wearing a t-shirt from the company, or maybe you're wearing a uniform from that company. Whatever it happens to be, it's causing an issue where the reputation of the company can be distorted, harmed in some particular way. So as it points out here, if the employer can demonstrate that the employee's off-duty conduct harmed its business or reputation, then it can be just cause to remove that individual from the company. And there are a few situations where this could be true. Again, when you are wearing uniforms or hats or t-shirts or something from your company, or you're making note that you work for that particular company. I've met people who do this foolishly. I met a guy once who actually told me he was entitled to do something, which I thought was kind of stupid. But he told me he was entitled to do it because he worked for the police department. And I thought to myself, maybe you better smarten up a little bit. And I won't explain what he was doing, but a lot of people were wondering if he had any brains in his head. So big and tall employee makes negative comment in regards to a young girl who died by suicide on social media, sparking outrage. Big and Tall, which is a very large retailer, terminated the employee as a comment made outside work damage to business. Well, once again, because they know who the employee is and they know who they're working for, a comment that is negative in that nature is definitely going to draw attention to the company. And this is something that you just can't do. It's not fair to the company that you offer yourself as being connected. I know a guy on YouTube who every time he talks on YouTube always tells you, I work for Microsoft and nothing that I intend to talk about will reflect anything against Microsoft. It's almost like a disclosure statement. Off-duty conduct again, once again, moonlighting. Now, this does not mean that you go grabbing the moon and trying to light your way. Not usually just cause, unless it harms your employer. You may actually be working somewhere else. This is what moonlighting really does define. Stealing customers by working for cash under the table. This does help, hurt, I should say, your employer. I'll give you a good example of this one. Years ago, I was at Good Life Fitness, and I hired a guy there to help me out with some of the more difficult exercises I was having difficulty with. And the guy was hired through them. So Good Life actually provided this guy, and he was helping me for an hour a day. Every day I paid him for an hour to come and help me out with some of these exercises. But one day he actually came up to me and he said, you know, you're spending a lot of money. I can cut that in half for you. Okay, we'll make an agreement between the two of us and I'll be here every day to help you. I still, have a member here. And I was thinking to myself, this is not fair to the company because it is through the company I actually had made the contract. And therefore he has to live up to that. And it was kind of stealing from the company. And I suspect that if he was doing that with me, he would turn around and do that with all of the customers that they were giving him. And remember, the company is the one finding the customer. And you're the one who is actually stealing from the customer when you're doing like that. You're stealing the customers. This is also something that insurance agents, real estate agents, anyone who works as an agent sometimes runs into the moonlighting side of this. Incompatibility is another big issue too. Difficult for an employer to dismiss employees simply because I don't like you. You don't look so good. I don't like your face. You got a beard or whatever. Whatever the reason that your head's bald, whatever the rationality is, it's just personal dislike. and you don't like the individual, and therefore you perceive them as being incompatible with your particular department or your company. Employer must prove that the employee's personal habits harm its company. So that's a difficult one to prove, especially if the individual is applying their skills the way they were hired to. Again, it's really an incompatibility. They don't like the individual for some reason or another, or the skill set doesn't fit the job. That's a possibility. Very difficult to prove. They're not joking with this one. It is difficult to prove. Need to show that the employee has fallen below what was expected of that individual. Whenever they sign their contract, there is an expectation as to what needs to be accomplished. And if they are finding that the performance of that individual is substandard in some way, then incompatibility does fit because you can prove that the individual is not up to speed. However, then you run into the requirement to assist that individual in some way. So you need to accommodate, perhaps not. It depends on the severity of the situation. They point at something I pointed out day number 1 of this course. You must have a paper trail for everything. The key element here is keeping abreast of everything. So you write down everything that happens with an employee and it's put in their file. Sometimes you'll find that in a human resource department, I know that Quetisha wants to be in human resources. One of the things you'll often notice is that some people have a folder for employment that's only got maybe 15 or 20 pages in it. They've been with the company 3-4 years. Then another person has been with the company for 2 or 3 years, and they may have 100 pages in theirs. So it's really a question of you document everything that takes place with that employee, because if it becomes necessary to withdraw them from your company, you sometimes need to prove that you have made every attempt necessary. Employer must have evidence of positive dismissal, discipline, I should say, through the progressive discipline system. You must show that you have made a real attempt to help that individual. So if the individual's ability to use, let's say, Excel or Word or Microsoft in general is really low, then it's up to the company to determine, is it feasible to try to train that individual, bring them up to speed. If it's not, then of course, maybe you have to give them another job or release them. But in most cases, there's this requirement of accommodating that individual by trying to assist them to get up to speed somehow. So if I keep good records and I've tried everything I possibly can, it may be necessary to dismiss the employee. Making job requirements clear and reasonable, therefore there shouldn't be any misunderstandings. But sometimes people get jobs because they have a good argument to get that job, and they may actually lie a little bit on their resume. So you may find that they don't have the skill you thought they had. But now that you're stuck with them, you need to try to help them a little bit to get up to speed. Bad part is if they find out that you really did lie on your resume, then they can dismiss you immediately, and there's no need for compensation, because that, again, is dishonesty. Providing adequate training and support. Well, these are the things that we try to do. We really do have a vested interest because we decided we wanted to hire the person. Obviously, there was a reason. And if it was a viable enough reason, then we definitely want to invest in that individual in some particular way. We warn the employee, once again, if they know we have clear requirements, then we warn that individual that failing to meet job requirements could result in the elimination of that job. And this is something that the individual should basically understand, that there is a necessity, there is a reason why they were hired. It is the function we hired them to do, and therefore they have to live up to the expectations of that job. They accepted the contract based on what was in it. And if that contract said you have to be able to type 5 letters an hour, then you need to type 5 letters an hour. You can't do 2 letters and say, well, my fingers don't move that fast. Because they'll show you how to use the yellow pages for a new job. Employee understands what is required. And again, this is really important. I keep hitting you on the head with this one, but you cannot hold a person responsible for something they are fully unaware of, or they even partially unaware of. They must understand. This is why companies are very, very studious. When they have a new policy, you have to initial it that you read it. When they have new elements that they want to bring in as policies for the organization, not only do you have to read it, but you have to sign it. And there may even be a test to prove that you understand it because it's significant. So we give them a reasonable length of time. This doesn't mean 24 hours. It means that maybe you have to give them a month. For somebody who's having difficulty, let's say, using their computer, well, we have to help them. We have to teach them how to use that program, and we have to give them enough time to actually begin to become good at it. So maybe it's a week, or maybe it's a month, or maybe it's a couple of days, whatever it happens to be. It must be a reasonable amount of time. And again, you have to take into consideration the individual. So employer documents every aspect of whatever form of correction is taken. If you take any kind of correction with that employee, both of you have to sign off on it, and both of you should have a copy of the plan that you intend to initiate. And again, my discoveries through the years have always been employees should be 100% in that process. They should be the ones who are telling you what kind of plan is needed, and you're signing off on it. In other words, you're helping that individual focus. Grounds that cannot constitute just cause. So there are exceptions. Employer cannot dismiss an employee for any of the following, and let's take a look at each one of them. Asserting their rights in the Human Rights Code. Remember, all 17 are grounds that they have the right to be aware of and the right to assert. Asserting his or her rights under the Employment Standards Act. Again, these are things that they have the right to ensure, that they get the minimum wage, that they also get their holiday pay, that they have the right to emergency leave. There's a lot of different things, but the paradox here is at least 50% of the working population do not know what their rights are. They do not know what they are. They have some vague idea, but you need to know how they fit in. And unfortunately, companies are not obligated to teach you this. For refusing unsafe work, I've met an awful lot of people who did not refuse unsafe work and became paralyzed in some situations. In other situations, lost hands, fingers, lost feet. I remember a guy, we used to joke around a lot, played soccer together, and he had lost his arm. And it was one of these things where the employer said, can you work a couple of extra hours and go and use that machine? And he didn't know how to use it, but he figured he'd figure it out. Well, it figured out how to take his arm off, and it happened instantly. So sometimes refusing these things is important, and the employer cannot dismiss you. For being involved in union-related activities, well, we already talked about organized labor, and you already know that you can involve yourself in these because they represent you. So let's take a look at this area as well. Frustration of a contract. Frustration of a contract is when neither party can live up to it. Perhaps you can't get into work, and perhaps the company just can't wait for 6 months until you figure out how to get to work. COVID-19 right now is creating a lot of frustration. And the rationality is if you were stuck in another country and you can't get back to Canada, then the company that had you as an employee has a real problem. They can't operate your position because you're not available. And secondly, because of international law, you may not be able to leave that country. So if you can't leave the country, then frustration takes place. So employment contracts may come to an end. And there is no notice whatsoever. It just simply means you cannot continue with that contract. It's impossible to live up to. So we call it frustration. Here they have a great example, a flood, a fire, an explosion in your particular business. Let's just say you work at a restaurant and they have a fire inside the restaurant. The health department comes in and says, well, you can't work in this environment. So the employer has no choice. They can't keep you because they can't pay for you. So what are they going to do? They break the contract due to frustration. Now, they do have to help you out a little bit too. Okay, can also occur if the employee goes to jail or let's say loses professional credentials. Maybe you had a truck driver's license and you were found on the side of the road with your truck and you didn't have a logbook. You're suspended. You don't drive for at least a month. So if you don't have your logbook and if you don't have your sleeping arrangement inside your logbook and you've been driving too many hours, you can be down with $1,000 fine. So maybe there's just frustration. They can't have you drive because you don't have a license anymore. So there could be a lot of different variables here. Truck driver losing license due to speeding. This is only one example. There are many possibilities for that field and many others. If an employee has a prolonged illness is another area. You can't work, so what are you going to do? You can't keep paying the person. And remember, there are limitations to unpaid connection to that individual for emergencies. And if it exceeds that period of time, or if both parties agree, which is probably to the advantage of the employee as well, because they'll be able to collect EI or some other benefit from the government. But as long as they are continuing to be an employee, they may not be able to. Again, it depends on the circumstances. Employers should wait at least 2 years before even considering ending an employee's relationship on a basis of frustration caused by employees' prolonged illness. In our society, we try desperately to keep those connections. And maybe there's a good reason, but an individual can become extremely ill, can contract cancer, can have all kinds of issues. I know one of our instructors whose fiance, in a sense, acquired a kind of a brain virus and was down for very close to 2 years before she was able to stand on her own, feed herself, etc. So there's always this possibility it hits you from nothing, and all of a sudden you're down for a long period of time. During the 2 years, an employer should be obtained regular up-to-date information about the employee from the employee's position. Again, we need to know because number one, that job changes. Nothing is static. Everything changes. Everything's dynamic. So the job you were doing 2 years earlier may have totally, let's say, totally changed from what it was. So let's go back to our wrongful dismissal again. You need to give notice. Not only is notice required, but the employer's separation package must meet at least the minimum requirements. And again, it depends on how long that individual has worked for you and what the circumstances are. If the employee sues for wrongful dismissal, which definitely can happen, okay, they could be entitled to additional damages. Punitive damages are often given, and also pecuniary damages are often given. So you can actually have multiple types of damages paid out to this individual simply because they lost their job. And the bad part of this is justices normally will send them back to work. So not only do they get a big payment from you, but you also have to take them back again. Courts generally assume older workers will have more difficulty finding, let's say, some kind of employment that's comparable in one form or another. So their tendency is to give them more benefit of the doubt. Courts often give larger notice periods to people who are in excess of 50 years of age. Now, it's kind of a conundrum because for some companies, they prefer older workers. For other companies, they prefer younger workers. So sometimes they remove people who are at a certain age number. So when you get to your 50s, many companies will even give you, let's say, early retirement, in which case they'll pay you a certain bulk sum to get rid of you. But the bad part of it is it's really hard to get a job when you get to a certain age. Some companies, as I say, do like older workers because they're a little bit more stable. But that's not always the case either. Courts can offer additional compensation on these damages. And again, there are different types of damages. No judicial ceiling on damages. It depends on what those might be. Let's just say that an individual who was over 50 was removed from a job, and it was only because they conspired to get rid of them so they could hire younger people. Well, with that kind of a condition, the person may lose their house because they can't pay their mortgage payments, or may lose their car, or may lose other things. So a judicial system can actually provide them with very significant amounts. And these amounts can be very high. So avoiding wrongful dismissal claims, hiring intelligently. Again, you're looking for the right person for that job. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this course, it's a lot more difficult than you think it is. You think it's really simple. People are constantly asking you for an opportunity, but you have to filter through them and make sure that they fit your culture within your company. Maybe your particular group of people are all of a certain intellectual level or emotional level or particular behavioral level, whatever it happens to be. You have to find the right people to fit that particular genre. And once again, that's a difficult thing to do sometimes. Including up-to-date termination clauses in employment contracts simply means be abreast of what changes have taken place in the legal system and make sure your contracts live up to the expectation. Remember, I've mentioned this several times now. Human resource people are fundamentally responsible for ensuring the company remains legally compliant. So this means it's up to them to ensure that the policies are up to date, that the contracts are up to date, and that people are educated to what are the standards of that particular region or jurisdiction, legal jurisdiction. Again, what companies need to be very cognizant of is how long do they have to keep somebody in probationary periods? So maybe what they need to do is make it a full year or maybe 6 months. It depends on what it is. If a person happens to be, let's say, a bricklayer, this is going to be a very long period of time. You want to make sure that they really know what they're doing. And therefore, this could take time because usually when you hire somebody for those jobs, they don't do the job. They watch for at least 3-4 months before they get to do anything. So probationary periods can be very viable. Creating a paper trail, we've talked about this, document everything. And also making sure that people are very much aware of when changes are taking place. This is why a lot of companies nowadays follow the Disney model. The Walt Disney Company, Disney itself, actually has a lot of training videos and training programs for managers, supervisors, and employees. And a lot of companies buy those programs because they're so well thought out. So you do, as many companies do nowadays, when they have their meetings for a department, they oftentimes disseminate information before it takes place so that you basically know what's about to happen, what is going to change within your environment as time goes on. And also making sure that you really do know if just cause is, let's say, viable. So determining whether a just cause claim is sustainable, I should say, progressive discipline has been used in one particular way or another, or just simply you are going to have some legal issues at some point. Again, we really do want to make sure that people are aware of what is going to happen. You don't just spring things on people because it causes a reaction. There's always the need to fight back or to present your point of view or protect yourself in some way or another. So if just cause, determine the appropriate notice time that you should be using, handle the termination professionally. And for most companies, terminations are rarely done anymore by a single individual. And the reason for this is because of the lawsuits that constantly take place out there. People do stupid things, especially when they get angry. They tend to fire people without rationality or without thinking. And sometimes this is not a good thing. So most companies nowadays, it's usually 2 individuals will be present. One is a witness, usually in another department, and both of them will actually sit down and explain why this process is taking place. Providing outplacement counseling is something that is usually done for management and above. So this is why I say you want to jump into management, because they usually have the golden parachute as well in one form or another. Outplacement simply because without a manager, a department literally does its own thing, and it doesn't really focus on the company's benefit or goals. So with a proper educated manager or a well-trained manager, then the department will run smoothly and everybody's efforts will be applied to the outcome that the company needs. So this is why sometimes outplacement counseling is provided, because they recognize that you could turn around and say, wait a minute now, I don't agree with you. It's better to get rid of you. If there's a real reason to get rid of you, then they need to provide you with help to help you with the next jump. However, I have had experience with a number of organizations which we've done speeches before. I know a friend of mine has done a lot of speeches. There is a company, organization, I should say. What are they called again? I can't remember. It'll come to me. This organization is free of charge, and it's for anyone of senior management and above. The chances of them ever getting a job in their particular field again is about 1%. That's the viability of ever getting a manager's job again. And the reason is they have been released from the company, and no one wants somebody else's, let's say, um, individuals that they want to get rid of. Nobody wants to hire them. So these people really do try for years and years and years. So outplacement service kind of prevents a lot of lawsuits from taking place where the managers may actually sue to get their job back. Get a signed release where possible. Once again, when you sit down with somebody and you explain why that individual is being withdrawn from the company, you also explain what kind of policy, what kind of remuneration they're going to receive, what kind of severance, what kind of outplacement, what kind of insurance is going to be maintained and for how long. In other words, their health benefits. Usually they do not end right away. Again, this is to protect you from being sued by that employee. So we often get them to sign that, okay, we're happy, we're leaving. Carefully considering all the issues when providing a letter of reference. I've mentioned this a number of times. A lot of companies nowadays refuse to give them. And they refuse to give them because there are legal consequences for providing erroneous information. If, for instance, you release somebody because they were, let's say, abusing other people, beating them, hitting them, or something of that nature, or swearing at them, insubordination, what have you, and you gave them a reference saying they were a nice person, good employee, loved to have kept them, just couldn't do it, then the other company hiring them would run into the same kind of disobedience, insubordination, and abusiveness. They could then turn around and sue the other company who gave them a reference. This is something you have to be very careful of. We live in a society where you must be responsible for your behavior. And if you're writing, let's say, a reference for someone else, make sure it's accurate. If somebody asks you for a reference and you just can't, in all honesty, give them a reference, don't. Because it can be held against you. And someone could come around and sue you. That company who hires them based on your comments could turn around and sue you because you caused damage to them. So as I said, many companies refuse to allow their staff to do this. For damages when it comes to wrongful dismissal, so employee that has been unfairly dismissed, and sometimes they just simply fired them for no reason at all, are entitled to certain things. They're entitled to their salary, the amount of salary they would have received. He will lose during the reasonable notice. In other words, didn't get his notice, was just simply ushered out the door as a result of wrongful dismissal. And again, this individual can sue them. Usually the Board of Labor will go after them anyhow, but the benefits include club memberships, meal expenses, subsidies, subsidized mortgages, which for higher management is usually one of the issues. Also, anything that would have been made available during regular employment. There's so many things, cars, almost anything that that individual is consuming or using or being provided with. Insurance, employer should continue coverage of any insurable benefits. This is for a reasonable period of time. This could be for a few months. It could be for 6 months. But the company will have to decide what are the ramifications for not doing it. A lot of companies will continue for several months thereafter just to ensure that the individual is protected. And employees that have been unfairly dismissed could also be entitled to bonuses, required to pay bonuses to the employee as long as they are part of the regular compensation package. Again, remember, these individuals have a valued part within the organization. Without them, you could not achieve the things that you are achieving. To that end, we can actually hold the company responsible for any bonuses or percentages of a bonus or parts of a bonus that would have normally been paid out. Stock options, again, this is for virtually any employee within a company that provides this option. Employees may continue to accrue exercise their stock options until the end of a reasonable notice, but that notice by definition will be in your contract. If stock options are available within a company, it will be defined. It'll be defined because there are legal ramifications for when you can actually sell a stock if you acquire it through a company. And the rationality behind this, I'm pretty sure that Cholet may have explained this to you, but when you receive stocks through a company, there is a legal covenant where you may be aware of certain behaviors or activities, or let's say accounting practices or legal constraints within an organization that could give you an advantage in selling or purchasing. So there are usually windows that are available. They often take place within 6-month intervals, or for a very short period of time, or maybe a 1-year interval. So every year you have a window where you can sell them or buy more. Pension entitlements are oftentimes compensation that are derived from a contract. So in this case here, the employer must compensate an employee for any loss of pension entitlements during the period of reasonable notice. Now, this is not the oldest set of rules, because when I worked at NCR as a teenager, going into my early 20s in a sense, I worked for NCR, and there were a couple of people. It caused a lot of trouble in that particular company. There were a couple of seniors who had been working for the company for over 30 years each. And both of them were supposed to retire that year, which is not a great thing. And this is when the CEO left the Canadian operation and a new one came in and made some changes. They actually closed the pension fund that they had. So this meant that those two employees would not receive a pension. This was possible then, and nowadays it's illegal. You can't do that. So you would, if they were paying into something, you would have to continue that. You couldn't just simply give them what's there without any interest or anything else. And once again, the damages. So the employer will not be entitled to do gratuitous bonus payments. One of the bonuses not, let's say, part of a regular compensation package, do not have to be continued. Okay, so this is not entitled to. The employee is not entitled to. The company vehicle, well, once again, it belongs to the employer, not required to compensate an employee for the use of a company vehicle. They would have had to respond to themselves anyhow. And work-related expenses do not have to be included, is not incurred as the employee is not working. So since the employer is no longer encouraging that individual to participate within the company, then that individual can no longer use those expenses that they normally would have. The next area is constructive dismissal. So in this case here, the employer makes fundamental changes to the employee agreement. we've talked about this before. Maybe that individual is now a supervisor, or maybe that individual is now working in another department, which is not covered by that particular contract. And maybe the job function is identical, but it's not the same department. And therefore, the contract has to change because the reporting parties will be different. In other words, different managers, different people that they'll be dealing with. So change is done without reasonable notice or explaining the consequences. Again, constructive dismissal requires that they know and understand what's going on. Further to this, they're usually informed that the contract will cease to exist and a new contract will be created and they will have to sign that new contract. Fundamental breach of the contract takes place simply because it no longer applies. So it entitles the employee to resign in response and claim damages if necessary. Remember, the contract is not completed. So if it is going to be withdrawn, then some compensation needs to be paid if the employee decides not to continue with the company. It does happen. Maybe the company is moving or there's another reason. Sometimes the employer is deliberately making it difficult for the employee because they want them to leave. They want them to resign. This is also true. They don't want the employee. They want to remove them from the company. And what they sometimes do is they will use constructive dismissal. This still allows the employee to receive EI, so employment insurance, but it also means that they can change the job definition and therefore hire somebody else for the new position, but they cannot hire somebody for the same position. That's a very important caveat. So sometimes it's not intentional. It may just be a matter of fact. You have no choice. You just have to release that individual. Never a question of motives. And as they point out here, the court test is objective one. Would a reasonable person, now this is a term I want you to remember. Okay, we're going to come back to, whoops, jump back there again. Reasonable person is a term that will come up again much, much later. Reasonable person is how a court actually makes a determination. They look at all the facts and they say, would an individual of average intelligence with, in this particular field, whatever field it happens to be, make decisions or make choices of a particular nature? So they look at it as an objective test. The position to find the changes imposed by the employer unreasonable or unfair. So would a reasonable person actually decide that they don't want to work for the company because of the changes made? That's fundamentally what they're looking at. A reasonable person is an average individual from that industry with average intelligence, average skill sets, who has been with the company, working with them, and would that kind of a person with a reasonable level of intelligence actually choose to break their contract or not accept the changes? Constructive dismissal, and there are a few areas here that we want to look at. First of all is the big one, money. So changes in your compensation. This can happen with COVID-19. A lot of people were asked to take discounts. So if you were making $20 an hour, the company came by and said, we have a new contract for you to sign. We're unable to continue paying you 20. You're actually going to make 15 from now on. So this would be the same thing, constructive dismissal. Your contract will be invalidated, a new contract will be made. However, from what I've heard of some of these contracts out there right now, the changes being made are that they will, as soon as things pick up again, they will pay you back. So in other words, you'll get your money back again. The changes in duty, which is a big issue, because once again, you can't hold somebody responsible for something that isn't defined in their contract. So changes of hours, again, these are things defined within a contract, so hours and scheduling, and also geographic location, which is also part of your contract. Layoffs, which is, one of those issues that takes place every so often, and unintentional work environment, untenable work environment. In other words, a very poison type of environment to work in. So let's take a look at this. Some changes have taken place within your pay structure or the benefits package. If that is defined within the contract, go ahead.
Oh, there's no one. No. I'm gonna trade you information for you to just back off of these toaster strudels. It's good information.
So leveling price? No.
No, not solo leveling information. No, it's not about anime.
Oh.
It's about clothes.
Okay, fine, go ahead.
Keston,
Yes?
is this part of your discussion of compensation?
Oh, sorry, my sister. My sister just came, so I was talking to her real quick.
Okay.
All right, sorry, my.
So that was a good example of compensation. Fantastic. So changes in compensation, once again, there can be significant changes that take place. Changes in duties are the same thing. You cannot be held responsible for something within the contract which is not stipulated. So once again, if you're asked to do something that's not in your contract, you don't have to do it. And therefore, a new contract is necessary to redefine your particular duties. And that goes for your schedule as well. So if you have hours or schedule, let me go back to that. And there's a significant change. In other words, maybe your company decides to make it a 3-day work week instead of a 5 in order to keep more staff on. They decide to split the week between, let's say, 2 people instead of having 2 people working side by side throughout the week. So again, it could be that there's a significant change taking place. You need to be aware of it, and you also need to sign a new contract. Changes in location are a big issue because sometimes companies find it just too expensive. Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal are probably the most expensive places in Canada to run a business. And a lot of companies try to leave and go outside, especially manufacturing of any kind, want to get as far away from Toronto as possible because it's literally day and night. In fact, it can be half the price, literally half the price of what you pay in Toronto. So this could be for wages as well. Wages are less outside the city limits, whereas they may be really high inside the city. Maybe in Toronto, I have to pay $15 a square foot for my office space. And let's say in Cambridge, I pay $6 a square foot. And maybe in some small town, I pay $3 a square foot. So there's very significant differences. And sometimes companies have no choice but to leave that particular area. So they sometimes have to let go of employees, but there is a requirement that they must offer the opportunity to the employee. So once again, relocation to be significant to constitute constructive dismissal. Once again, the company is responsible to assist you in moving. But the paradox here is in most families, you usually have 2 people working in that particular family. And for one of them to simply move 100 miles away is not reasonable. So constructive dismissal is definitely going to take place. And whether or not the individual has transportation or is there any kind of public transportation available. Again, these can be determinants in deciding how to go forward with constructive dismissal as far as geographic location. Layoffs are another area, and unfortunately, they do take place, and they usually take place because there just isn't enough money in the company. So, employer does not have the right to lay off employees unless the layoffs are authorized by let's say, express or implied term within the contract. Again, you may run into a situation where you just don't have a choice. So laying off the individual, remember, up to 13 weeks, you can recall them again. Anything beyond 35 weeks, of course, they're released. But in most situations, we really don't want to lose the employee. That's losing an asset. It's easier to lose a machine than it is an actual good employee. So laying off is something they often try to do. The paradox here is it should be definable. Employer tries to temporarily lay off the employees without layoff clause, then the employee has the grounds to sue for wrongful dismissal. Again, if it's not in the contract, you can't really go ahead and do that. So imprudent to ensure the employment contract has temporary layoff clause. You basically know your industry. When you're creating a contract, the human resource department should kind of rationalize what is the history of that particular type of business and whether or not the potential is there for a layoff. Let's just say that you're producing a product and you lose your main customer. What are you going to do? You don't have enough sources of income coming in, and maybe that one employer is millions of dollars a year. So this means you're definitely going to have to release employees. But sometimes you don't want to release them because maybe you're looking for another customer to replace them. So now I want to keep you. So how do I keep you? I lay you off, but that means it has to be in the contract. Unattainable work environment. This is the environment from hell. In other words, a very negative environment. It's not nice to work in. Not everybody runs into this kind of thing, but it does happen where you do get people who bully you around. They're used to doing that. That's their behavior. In most cases, you should be going directly to the Human Resource Department and levying a complaint. And if that doesn't work, then the Board of Labor. But bullying and harassment in the workplace is prohibited. If you are the person, then you can be removed from that particular company. Failure to act creates a hostile work environment. Definitely, people don't like being pushed around too much. In the United States, they call this going postie, where somebody comes to work with a gun and starts shooting people. Unattainable working environment is the responsibility of the employer. A manager must keep a safe environment, and this is why you must deal with problems as they occur. You don't hold off, you don't wait, you involve yourself immediately. Whether the employee likes the idea that you intervened or not is irrelevant. It's the company that you represent, and therefore you must work immediately to solve problems. You don't want a poison environment because it really does come back to bite you at some point. Employee has no option but to resign simply because they're the perpetrator, they're the bully, they're the harasser, and you just need to get rid of that person. You cannot keep them in your environment. Employer will have constructively dismissed the employee through non-action. This is another area you have to be careful of. You must react when a situation occurs. How can the employer avoid constructive dismissal claims? Be careful. Avoid reducing employees' hourly rate. If you just simply reduce somebody's rate, they can go to the Board of Labor and levy a complaint against you. They could also seek claims against you for the courts or even through the Board of Labor. When presenting a significant change to the employee's duties, make sure that they are fully aware in advance. This way you can remove the possibility of constructive dismissal. Employers should ensure employees know that their particular function is still a valuable member in the organization, but you have to do something and you have to change something, and therefore constructive dismissal of your contract becomes a necessity. For whatever reason it exists for that employer, they have no choice but to break the contract. Employers should explain the changes within the context of where the organization is heading. It's important for the employee to understand that maybe they're taking a job cut. Maybe their supervisor is going to lose their supervisory capability and become just a general employee again. Maybe they're losing part of their salary. They have to know what is the organization moving towards and why is it necessary in the first place. Most people are understanding. They recognize that they're either on the unemployment line or they still have a company to go to in the morning, but there may be changes. And also how the new structure fits in with what they're going to be doing. So maybe they will be doing more work, less pay, or maybe they'll be doing more work whether they like it or not. So ensuring the contract employment has clauses for relocation or for layoffs. These are the things that we definitely need to make sure are in there. And all these additional duties that the individual may be required to do, make sure that that clause is in the contract as well. Ensuring that all the bullying and the harassment are dealt with in a very timely manner. Now, keep in mind, you just cannot wait. So this is not something where I wait a week. This is something that I call you into the office immediately and we have a talk. We cannot allow it to propagate, because the longer it takes, the more it begins to influence others within the department or the company. So these things must be dealt with immediately. Depending on the age group, there's a considerable movement in this particular area of resignation. Resignation has several different connotations. One of them being that you may be forced into resignation, and the other one is you're not forced into it. So let's take a look at this one. Resignation should be formally accepted. This is important that it be done in this particular way. Resignations must be voluntary. Now, keep in mind, sometimes people are forced into it. Employment insurance is very much aware of this. The Board of Labor is very much aware of this as well. Inferring resignation from an employee's conduct does not guarantee resignation, but we're going to look at each one of these areas. Dismissing a resigned employee, how we go about doing it, and wrongful resignation. We'll take a look at that one. The most important thing here is this one here, exit interview. The exit interview is crucial. Now, when we get to it, we'll talk about it. So resignation should be formally accepted. Whoops. There we go. So resignations may be retracted by the employee up to the time the employer formally communicates that they have received it. So yes, they may have the letter on their desk. They haven't looked at it yet. They haven't agreed to it yet. So you can still withdraw it. If you were to send it to someone in the email, you could always retract that email as long as they don't read it and acknowledge it. Until they acknowledge it, you still have the ability to withdraw it. So remember the offer and acceptance. I'm offering my resignation. The individual, the company must accept. Sometimes what they want to do is find out what's going on. So there's still a chance to withdraw it because they haven't accepted it yet. Resignations must be voluntary. So ultimatum, in this case here, the employer cannot give a choice between resigning or being dismissed, equals not voluntary. This used to be something a lot of companies used to do. In order to ensure that you would get, let's say you wouldn't sue them, you would actually get this ultimatum. If you don't leave, I will fire you. So you can resign and you can still get EI, which was actually employment insurance at that time. So these are things that some companies used to play with, but there's been some major changes through the years, and you cannot cause this to happen. If it does, you're still entitled to benefits. Fantastic. So constructive dismissal, employees can claim a change to the fundamental terms of their contract was the reason behind resignation, not voluntary. Well, once again, you're still entitled to benefits, and you can actually say, well, I couldn't do what I had to do, and therefore I resigned. You couldn't live up to the new expectations, and therefore you resigned. So once again, constructive dismissal. And there are many variations of that. Inferring resignation is another thing. You know, people get hot-headed once in a while. They say things they shouldn't say. And they sometimes say, I quit, or they may have other comments that they make. It doesn't really mean that they quit. So inference is just not accepted. If the employee is distressed, which is usually the case, that they're angry, they're upset, they're frustrated, they're stressed out, whatever it happens to be, they say a lot of stupid things. But you have to open your mind a little bit and be rational. So it really is not going to be kept or held on to. Yeah, the employer may say, go home, but that's to cool down. You still have the right to come back to work again. If the employee clears his desk, hands in his keys, this conduct could be seen as clear the employee has in fact resigned. That's a possibility. Remember, if you show or indicate significantly that you intend to separate your connection with that company, then that could actually be an indicator. But remember, your contract may actually stipulate a requirement. We don't assume anything. Always send a formal letter accepting the resignation. Remember, you must make sure the company is compliant with all the legal requirements, and that means we try everything to make sure there's a paper trail and that people understand where they stand. If somebody clears their desk and walks out, and you decide to accept that as being, let's just say that it's a resignation, then you want to make sure that it is documented and that the individual receives a copy. It's important to make sure they get a copy, believe me. Dismissing or resigning an employee. Employer does not want to resigning employee to come to work. If you don't call that individual, they're entitled to be paid. Again, this is one of those interesting little caveats. Advise the employee they will be paid throughout the notice period. They should not attend work again. So there may be a reason why you don't want that individual to come back to work. One of the biggest issues is talking to other employees, and you don't want, let's say, a disruption within your environment. So sometimes it's better just simply close the door. They don't come back. And this often means talking to the other employees and suggesting that this individual no longer has the right to enter the building. This individual, they should avoid this individual when they're on the property. Again, once again, this could be, if you don't actually make sure of this, that the individual is continued to be paid, then the individual kind of is still there within your company. So may face wrongful dismissal charges. Again, that individual could sue you. And damages limited to the notice period that they should have received. And again, for some companies, this could be a significant amount of money paid up front. Wrongful resignation. Employee has reciprocal obligations to provide reasonable notice of resignation. This could actually be part of your contract as well. We talked about that earlier, but you should be giving your company at least a week to 2 weeks, and in most cases, 2 weeks. But it can be a shorter period of time, depends on whether or not they want you to leave. Rarely do employers sue employees for failure to provide reasonable notice, but it does happen. So don't just overlook this one. If a company spends a lot of money on training for somebody, and then they leave the company once they get the training, that company could sue them for all the training. And believe me, corporate training is very expensive. So we're talking about thousands of dollars, sometimes thousands just for a day. And if you're taking 20, 30 days in the year, that could be an entire year's income. So this is the thing that I think is really, really, really important, especially when it comes to dismissing an employee or the individual decides they want to leave the company. For human resources and for the manager of that department, this is really important stuff. You need to know why. You really have to know why. It could be just simply that that individual is tired. The individual has young children at home, wants to spend more time with the children. That's really valuable information. And I'll tell you why in a second. But we really want to know, maybe they're having difficulty with people that they're working with. Maybe they're not getting the resources they needed to do the job and they're feeling bad about it. There can be so many reasons. But if we know that the reason is simply that they want a break, then they're the perfect resource when we get really busy and we need temporary staff, because they know the job, they know the company, they know the policies, they know the culture of that company. So it's nice to know why they're leaving. But there are reasons sometimes where you really want to know what's the problem, especially with new employees who decide to leave within a short period of time. I can tell you horror stories in this particular area. This is why I'm telling you that when it comes to an exit interview, it's really important that you know why the individual is leaving. The bad part of this is not a lot of companies involve themselves in it. The smarter people who are well trained in human resources, they definitely do these exit interviews because they really want to know what's going on. Remember, as a human resource specialist, you do not do their job, and therefore you need to know anything that is caused a problem for them doing that job. You need to know what it is so that you can help correct those problems. So pitch to hire somebody and have them leave the same day. Provide valuable information and also feedback why they've decided that this is the wrong company for them. And maybe there are valid reasons, but as long as we know what they are, maybe we can use that to our future advantage. So opportunities to collect all company property, which is another key area here, like credit cards, keys, especially keys. There's been many situations where somebody has left a company, taken the keys with them, and refused to bring them back. And it cost probably $1,000 or $2,000 to have the locks replaced, because you just can't leave it the way it is. So it can be an expensive proposition. And maybe there are other things that they have, like let's say uniforms or something that need to be returned. Of course, this is also something that needs to be worked into things. If people are getting close to retirement, you need to know that. You need to know what their plans are, because usually when a person is retiring from a company, they have a lot of years of experience and it's hard to replace them. So sometimes it's necessary a year or 2 years in advance to start training people to take over that position when the individual leaves. Otherwise, it could be a hole in the company when they leave that you can't fill. This is not an uncommon problem. Sometimes a person leaves and you have nobody that can take their job. Nobody is available, so your company fails as a result. Abolition of mandatory retirement took place a number of years ago and has eliminated the 65 rule. It used to be that you had to retire whether you liked it or not. The problem with that is that at the age of 65, you probably have become a senior employee of that company, probably put in quite a few years, and now you're going to be retired and you don't have a choice, but you still want to work. So now you go back to that company and you're hired at a much lower rate because you're no longer using your seniority. You are now officially a new employee, and therefore you're starting out at the bottom. So a lot of people who are retired complained that politicians and judges did not have to retire. In reality, a politician doesn't have to retire, and a judge does not have to retire until they hit 90. Well, that's not fair, is it? If you have to retire at 65 and they can go on making 150,000 a year and just sit there and stare at you and pick their nose, that's not fair. So in this situation, it was abolished, which simply means that nowadays you retire when you want to. The only distinction that needs to be drawn here is at the age of 70 years of age. When you reach 65, you get a letter from the government telling you that you can either take your pension effective at 65 or you can take it when you reach 70 years of age. But you must take it at 70. You can't wait any longer. If you take it at 70, you get all the increments in between. So you actually do benefit rather significantly if you hold off. But a lot of people like to work. And it's not for the money, it's just they enjoy the day-to-day grind of actually working. They get used to it, I guess you could say. So found to be age-based discrimination, and effectively it was discrimination. In 2006, this is when it became the mandatory nature was obliterated, and it now became any age. It's up to you when you actually retire. No longer able to maintain a mandatory retirement policy unless, of course, there's a reason. Okay, this is why judges cannot continue past 90. There is a reduction in their mental skills. I don't agree with that. Usually, people who are constantly learning and constantly mentally active they don't show signs other than their physical body. The mind stays sharp. Hazel McCallion, she's well over 90 now. I've met her many, many times. I've talked to her many times. And the one thing I can tell you is she's the smartest person I've ever met who is an older person, simply because she's constantly mentally active. And that's the key. It keeps you fresh. So unless it's bona fide, there is no reason for you to have to retire. Carefully document the reasons for termination of an employee over 65. Again, this could come back to bite you if that individual decides they don't want to leave and you want them to leave. So there has to be a good paper trail. And this is what happens when you don't have a paper trail. Fantastic. You're all still there. Good show. And you're still listening. Well, maybe. Keston's arguing about food.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. He's probably got one hand on a noodle and is not letting her have it. Fantastic. So the good news is you have some exercises to do. I'm just going to throw those in here. Fantastic. And the other one. Assignment number 4 is being put in here. And there's also a section here for dismissal. So just going to open up the dismissal for a moment. Bring that over here. There we go. So this is an assignment I'd like you to do tonight. I'd like you to work on this one. So what types of dismissal are each of the following really, for each one of these scenarios, what kind of dismissal? And give a small explanation. You're preparing for the final exam right at the moment, so this is going to help you a great deal. And the other thing that I gave you here as well, let's just open that one up, is assignment number 4. So remember, you need to make sure I get those assignments. You can either put them on Brightspace under assignment and upload it, or you can send it to me as Keston has been sending it to me so that I at least have them and I can mark them. So in this case here, you're going to do assignment number 4, and you're working as an employment law specialist. So you just simply need to read the story and then write your answers in here as well. Again, once you finish this assignment, send it to me or put it on Brightspace. And once again, for those of you who have not used Brightspace before, it's really easy. I know that Tisha is actually using it. Let me just open it up here as well. Fantastic. And we'll just take a look at Brightspace. And it is human resources. So in the activities, when you click on activities, you can see the quizzes are here. There is a quiz for you to do too, which is good that we finished a little early. And the assignment. So your assignments, and there are 4 of them, they're each here. I only have one handed in at this particular point, and yet there should be 3 here. Now, I know Keston has sent me both of these, so I have both of them from Keston as well. So what I'd like you to do is submit them here if you haven't submitted anything yet. You already are up to number 4 at this point. So make sure that you're putting them in before Friday, because Friday they're all going to be marked. And of course, the quiz. So let's just take a look at the quiz. Quiz number 7 is available. So the quiz is available. The midterm you've done, the final will be available on Friday. So the quiz is currently available to you. Nobody has connected yet, so I can see that. So are there any questions thus far?
No, sir, no questions.
No questions?
Yes, same for me. One question. It's not about this. It's more about the quizzes. We had 7. Only 6 of them would count.
That's right. So we look at the highest scores, and 6 of the highest will actually be marked, but the 7th one will actually be the lowest score you had.
Okay, perfect.
Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
Fantastic. So what I'd like you to do is do the quiz and also start into number 4. So assignment number 4, if you haven't finished 3 yet. If you haven't finished 3, finish off 3 as well. and then start into 4. And we will see everybody tomorrow again.
See you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon, guys.
You too. Have a nice day, everyone.
Take care, guys.
Sir, please don't forget to put the assignment and stuff in the group chat.
Yep, that I'm doing.
Yep.